Voucher programs have their historical sort of roots in this intellectual framework for discrimination. I mean, that's really what it comes down to. Friedman's framework created sort of this pathway to provide parents who did not want their children going to school with children of color at that time to find alternatives on the taxpayer dime.
It's important to be part of a union because you have to have a voice.
Welcome to Union Talk. I'm Randi Weingarten.
Welcome to another episode of Union Talk. And if you've actually ever seen me in the news any time in, the last 20 or 30 so years, you'd hear me talk about how we want every public school to be a place where parents want to send their kids, where educators want to teach. And because of those two things, kids actually thrive. When parents and teachers are together, and when we're working with the powers that be to get the investments we need to address kids' needs, more often than not, kids are thriving. And that is what our North Star is. But at the same time, as we've been talking about this, for, the last couple hundred years, that's who public educators are. There's been this magic bullet that's been called vouchers that are sold as gold tickets to families and others to, with this idea that if you get a voucher, that is your ticket to something that is golden for a family. And frankly, over the course of the last 50 or 60 or 70 years that vouchers have been spoken about, sometimes they're spoken about to go to religious schools. Sometimes they're spoken about for kids who are vulnerable to get out of public schools, to get into a different place. And now they're spoken about in all of the above. But often they are being used to simply erode the promise and the potential of public education. Now, there's a lot of people who could talk about vouchers, but our guest today, Michigan State Professor Josh Cowen, he's been studying vouchers for a long time, for a couple of decades. But before we dive into vouchers, what I really want to ask Josh about initially is that, remember I said he's a Michigan State professor. And if anybody who's been following the news, you know that just last week, gun violence left 3 kids dead, 5 wounded on Josh's campus. And today, or, this week, when you're going to hear the podcast, we're taping it on President's Day. School is back in session. And I just want to ask Josh how he is and how the school is before we dive into vouchers. So, Josh, welcome to Union Talk, and how are you?
Thank you for that, Randy. I do appreciate being here.
And we love dogs. Dogs are us.
I'm so sorry about that. Let me get...
This is what we do in terms of this podcast. We make it real. We have dogs. We have cats. We have alarms on the outside. But Josh, how are you?
I'm okay. It's been a very surreal week. My first sort of concern is honestly for these students of ours. They've been through so much. The university has I think appropriately given us substantial flexibility in terms of how we deal with the course requirements for the next couple weeks before spring break starts. I think there's a mix. Different. I've had a lot of different students say different things in terms of coming back, but I will say today has been a really under the circumstances, a very affirming day. The sun is shining. There are literally thousands of people on campus right now walking around with support dogs, with bags of food. You walk into most buildings and there's a table of staff or student volunteers handing out goodie bags to the students. It's very student centered as it should be. And our colleagues are, I think, hurting pretty acutely well. It's just it's a it's a difficult thing. For me, the thing that I'm thinking about on Wednesday, I go into my class of future educators, and that's the thing. They're great students. I'm really enjoying working with them this semester. There are 30 or so of them, and that's going to be a difficult conversation, I think. How to talk to these folks and hear what they have to say about going into the classroom one day. You don't want this to be the kind of conversation that we keep having, and for these young people, not only is there now a shooting here, but that moving forward, how do we prevent having to ask these folks to barricade doors, to keep running shelter in place drills. It's really difficult to get your head around. So I think there, from the acute sense, there's real grief here, but there's support, and people are trying to move forward in a community-based way as much as they can. But the larger issue of how do you talk to these folks who are 20 years old and are just thinking about careers and what they want to do with their lives? How do you talk to the ones that want to be educators, as I have to do, as you have to do, and get to do? It's a real privilege for us, right?
Right. Exactly right.
But they're scared, and what do you say to that? It's a difficult conversation.
And that it actually brings us. So, thank you, Josh, for that. And as Josh and I talked about before the podcast started, I will be on campus this Wednesday, and because I believe that every time there is a shooting, and look, we're 40 plus days into this year, the calendar year,
yeah,
and 73 mass shootings already this year, and Australia has figured it out. They no longer have a mass shooting problem. We, the strongest democracy in the world, should be able to figure this out. So I'll be on campus on Wednesday. I do actually believe that anytime there is a shooting in a jurisdiction where we represent members, we show up. And all of you have shown up so spectacularly all week already, but we want to, as the National Union, walk the walk with our members and our students there. And it just, this is the trust. Michigan State is a public university. Yes. We represent public universities around the country, the AFT. We represent public schools around the country. And it kind of gets us into this conversation on vouchers because people like Christopher Rufo kind of made it clear and to everyone that they are attempting to create universal distrust in public schools and public universities in order to create a universal voucher movement. So it's no longer, and I could go on and on, you can go on and on. Vouchers were initially proposed many moons ago as a way of trying to, help kids who are going to parochial schools and to basically try to vitiate the kind of separation of church and state that we had in this country. Plus and then there was a push for vouchers to be used to help low income kids to get out of so-called failing public schools, to get into to help low income kids. And that was kind of like the push in the last decade, in the 90s or the early 2000s. And now they've essentially just given up all pretense. And this year, there are voucher programs, I don't know in how many states, 16 states it's been proposed, 68 bills. House Republicans have done it. There's essentially, the bills these days is just to drain the public school system. There's no pretense anymore in any of these things. It is, as Rufo said, if they create universal distrust, they can create universal voucher systems to essentially displace the public school system. Now, you have been studying all this, and so that's why I figured let me ask you, Josh, because you really understand what's going on here and the difference between this push on vouchers right now versus, the pushes in the past.
Yeah.
So what's going on? Like,
So
what's
yeah,
going on right now?
so it is a big difference, and I've checked that with folks who have been around longer than I have on this, and everybody sort of understands in some way that it is different. I think a couple things are going on. One is, uh, there's some direct and I think fairly explicit exploitation of the COVID-19 pandemic. People are trying to kind of just make use of a tragedy, and they're going to do that as they have on a number of education related issues. So we're coming out of that, but the link to Rufo is right. So you can't disentangle today's voucher push from this larger kind of culture war, separation based form of education, which is entirely built on the idea that you're just not going to engage in a public kind of community oriented education community, and instead we're going to kind of just have individual groups of people, whether they're sort of church based, whether they're individual households, just kind of fend for themselves in kind of this free for all environment. I also think that what's really important, and people, I think most of your listeners, right, have all heard of Moms for Liberty and understand the sort of really awful things that are going on down in Florida with this push against teaching, the history of Black America and all of these different sort of kind of, again, cultural related activities, that they are all linked to this push against vouchers. And so where I've come into this is, until really about a couple of years ago, really until the COVID pandemic kind of hit its peak, the voucher advocacy groups were largely kind of in something of retreat, because there was this decade from 2012 or so until 2020, until recently, where we saw just unprecedented declines in academic outcomes for kids who went into voucher programs from public schools. So
Wait.
Okay.
Did you just say that again for our listeners, because the disinformation tree
Right.
would not tell you that.
So over the last decade, we've had some of the largest negative impacts on student academics we've ever seen in any area in education research, and they were so large in the four sort of states that have really scaled up voucher programs and allowed researchers to study them. They were so large that it really set the voucher movement back for some period of time. And so then there's been this scrambling the last couple of years trying to look for a new reason, because for a long time the argument was, well, we're going to give kids tickets out of so-called failing schools, and we're going to move them all to these elite private schools. Most voucher programs in the United States have some sort of veneer misleading label like Hope Scholarship or Opportunity Scholarship, and it's all a false promise, as it turns out. And so there really was, I think this was a major setback. Betsy DeVos herself, the voucher,
we'll call her the voucher queen.
The voucher queen herself, she as a public official at the U.S. Department of Ed, had to even answer for some of these programs, and sort of blamed it on implementation. But she, some good reporters got her on record saying, look, these weren't very well conceived. So they had to back up a little bit. And I think where they kind of were able to breathe some new life into this really kind of tired old idea, frankly, is through that Rufo-oriented kind of attack on public schools, attack on different sort of historically marginalized groups. All of that fits together into today's push. And so if you listen to voucher advocates, you will hear a few people talking about opportunity in very vague terms. But even and that's part of the conversation today. But they've really backed away from claiming that these things are golden tickets to academic outcomes because they all see the same data I do, frankly, and they know better. And so now it's become, the focus has been culture war. Heritage Foundation's been very big on this. We're gonna use people's fears of wokeism or whatever that is to spur voucher movements forward. And at the same time, in statute, when these bills are written, they make sure that there are no accountability or oversight provisions to gauge the academic performance of these voucher programs, because nobody wants to see the last decade's worth of results repeated into the upcoming decade. And so we have this kind of very dark lack of transparent kind of push for these programs. It's all culture war based at this point. There's really no good academic related reason to support these programs whatsoever.
So let's kind of get into a couple of these studies.
Yeah.
And I think that there's and you have said this to me a bunch, but you are really clear because you've looked at all of this about the three big areas where voucher programs have to date failed.
Yeah.
Number one, they divert funds from public schools. Number two, they have this history of corruption and waste. Number three, they use public dollars to encourage discrimination. And now number four, when you actually look at the data, the kids who are using a voucher to go to these other schools are actually doing worse in these in the situations they're going to, the privatized situations they're going to, than their counterparts in public schools. Did I get the big four right?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think, I will say the only the thing that worries me about the kind of fraud piece moving forward is that we're not going to know, because the current bills proposed almost without exception across the country today really strip away any ability for taxpayers to kind of gauge not only outcomes, but just even how the money's being spent. Right. So like in at least 10, 15 years ago, in the when I kind of came up through the program evaluation world, states, including voucher advocates, really wanted to know how these programs were doing while they were spending their money, because they were convinced that kids were going to do better academically, and they wanted to brag about it. And they were convinced that voucher schools were going to be able to go further with the dollar than public schools. And so they wanted as much daylight as possible 10, 15 years ago. That's how we know all these bad things today. And it's because we know all these bad things today that they are doing the exact opposite today. So I want to make clear that everything we know about voucher programs, we're not going to know in the next several years if voucher advocates have their way, precisely by design, which is an important thing.
So what I hear you saying is that whether you're a proponent of vouchers or whether you're against vouchers, basically anyone should want transparency and accountability to see how the public dollar gets used. And that should be something, for those listeners who are listening to this, that should be something that anyone should be pushing onto a state legislature or to the House Republicans.
I mean, my basic rule, we can debate about sort of the requirements that public schools have to face with respect to testing and financial disclosure and all that. There's good conversations to be had about that. But what to me at a bare minimum, and really further, but at a bare minimum, private schools taking taxpayer funds through a voucher system should have to disclose the same information public schools do, and the same information academic progress reports. Then that means, as long as we have standardized testing, and again, we can talk about whether that's a good or bad thing, but as long as we do, private schools that are being propped up on the taxpayer dime should have to take those tests too, is my view.
Yeah.
And that is something that people agreed with 10 years ago until we saw the devastating academic impacts, and now they want nothing to do with that.
Nothing to do with it.
They want to keep the public schools testing, but they don't want to keep the private schools testing.
Right. Well, I think that's a really important piece that, those people who are listening to this and are thinking about how they should size up these new bills, should push to have as part of these bills if these bills are going to actually pass. But it raises another question, Josh, about the issue about discrimination.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about what's going on in terms of this arena, in terms of what you're seeing?
Well, it's something of a homecoming for voucher programs. So a lot of folks know that this economist named Milton Friedman, a white dude like me, came up with this plan. He's sort of considered the godfather of school voucher programs, privatization and education in general too. And I think this is fairly common knowledge. There's lots of things named after Milton Friedman. He has a Nobel Prize. He's considered sort of the patron saint to these folks. What a lot of people don't talk enough about is the fact that Friedman's framework for what became vouchers today. He first wrote this very smart-sounding academic paper that he got all these prizes for later in 1955. And something else was happening in 1955, and that was the year after Brown versus Board of Education and the Supreme Court started to order racial integration. Voucher programs have their historical sort of roots in this intellectual framework for discrimination. I mean, that's really what it comes down to. Friedman's framework created sort of this pathway to provide parents who did not want their children going to school with children of color at that time to find alternatives on the taxpayer dime. Fast forwarding to today, a lot of voucher programs historically that have been tried are rooted in urban environments. And so it sort of in application, we haven't had necessarily the same overt form of racial discrimination that vouchers have their roots in, but we have different kinds of discrimination in this way today. First and foremost, and the thing that's been really publicly reported on, and this is what's related to the culture war piece today, is voucher schools have been quite transparent in their discrimination against LGBTQ kids, and not just LGBTQ identifying children, but any child, regardless of how they identify, who has LGBTQ parents. We have a number of reports out of Florida and out of Indiana, millions of dollars in taxpayer funding are going to these schools. Now, I think it's wrong. I think it's using the tax code, using public policy to bully and discriminate against kids. But stepping back for just a second, the framework for vouchers allows that in today's current legislation allows this to happen. It doesn't just these schools are not doing this secretly. We've had to have some reporters kind of dig this up because it's hard information to get, but these schools are making no secret about this whatsoever, because in each of the new pieces of legislation that have been pushing vouchers forward, and again, this is very different than they were 20 years ago, the legislation explicitly allows schools to keep what the word in language is creed or values. There's lines in each piece of legislation that says nothing in this legislation will prohibit the school from acting on its own creed or values. And so then hiding behind that kind of creed-based or often religious is what they call it, although I don't know, there are plenty of religions that don't discriminate against children. But this is how schools get around this, is they say it's part of our values to discriminate against these children, and the statute allows us to do it. And so, to me at this point, it's legal, it's protected discrimination. And that's, again, this isn't any secret. Like, nobody's as active as I've been in sort of developing a public voice on this issue. There have been certain things that no one ever tries to dispute with me. One is the devastating catastrophic academics. The data are too clear on that. And the other is that these schools discriminate. Also, the data are too clear on that. The only question is, what do we do about this at this point?
So I want to dig into this a little bit more, because you wrote an op-ed last summer, I think, in Heffinger Report about the moral case to be made against vouchers.
Yeah.
But part of it was on this issue of religion and also on religious, instead of me trying to characterize what you said, you made a moral case against it based upon, I assume, that if public money is going to go into these places, then these places can't basically traffic in discrimination or in the preferring of one religion over another. And, I give you a lot of credit for making that kind of moral case. So what did you say there, and why did you say it?
I mean, I think what I said is that, private schools, there are plenty of private schools out there that are mission driven, that are really oriented toward helping children. But these are not the kind of private schools that participate in voucher programs, generally speaking. The kind of private schools that participate in voucher programs often are subprime providers, barely hanging on, and often attached to types of religious organizations that have histories with discrimination. And it's really important to separate that out, because there are a lot of, listen, I sing in a choir, like there are a lot of a church choir, there are a lot of us out there who sort of reject the idea that faith-based programs have to be definitionally discriminatory, and yet that's the argument that these groups are hiding behind. And the last 20 years or so, I've sort of evolved into this position where I've always known that the data didn't support voucher programs. It's always been weak at best. We had a few tiny pilot programs in the about 20 years ago now, 1999, 2000, 2001, that showed some in 1,000 or so person programs, some in a very targeted way, in a laboratory, almost a laboratory type setting. These programs had slightly positive test scores, largely found, by the way, by one pro-voucher research team, but that's a side issue. But as they've scaled up, they've just been really devastating. And it's not just the discriminatory piece, which should alone, I've said this publicly, imagine you knew nothing about the discriminatory academics, and imagine that you didn't know about how much money these programs take from public schools. Imagine you didn't actually know either of those things, because state budgets are complicated. Psychometric testing is complicated. Imagine you didn't know anything about that, and all you knew was that millions and millions and millions of dollars are being spent on schools every year that discriminate against children, in this case LGBTQ kids, but it could be any child, because the schools are allowed to just say it's our creed, we'll discriminate. And that increasingly the backers of these programs are also tied very explicitly to election denial. That was the other piece of the moral case that I made, and that's just another, again, one of these sort of facts of reporting that just doesn't get talked about a lot. But the other piece of this is I want to kind of just link the devastating academic harm to the kids who are using these programs, and talk about that for just a second, if I can.
Yes, that would be great. That was my next question, but that's great.
Because this is where, to me, this moral piece comes in, and it's related to the fraud piece too. Fraud doesn't have to just be embezzlement, or we have plenty of stories of voucher type ESA programs. These are education savings accounts that are like ATMs for public expenses. We have instances of real fraud, like big screen TVs and trampoline parks and things like that. But the bigger problem is that 3/4 or so in each state that's actually reported data, 3/4 or so of voucher users are actually already in private school, and they're already in these programs where that'll take them. And then there's so this idea that vouchers help kids with new opportunities is on its face absurd. We know in state after state after state, about 3/4 of applicants once programs are started come from private schools. For the kids who transfer, listen, there are public schools that are struggling. We have not historically, as a community, always lived up to our promise with certain kids of color, right? Like, none of this is controversial. Sometimes kids with special academic needs, sometimes kids with, there's some groups that are struggling in society, and sometimes because our public schools do reflect society, they're going to be struggling there too. And what voucher programs have done, and what voucher advocates have done, is really akin, in my view, to predatory lending. And I've been to some of these places in Milwaukee and things like this as a evaluator, as a researcher. They set up these community fairs. They pass out like these applications, and they say, we'll fill out your school applications for you. Just sign up, and we'll do all the work. You come to our school. They're marketing themselves as life-saving opportunities for families who have struggled. And for those 25% of kids who do transfer right away from public to private, those are the kids that we have that data on, just the devastating academic loss, and we know that they've lost that academic growth from their public school trajectories. And we also know that those kids tend to it's a revolving door. About 15 to 20, 25% of kids every year in a voucher program actually exit. So what you see when you see sort of these rates of vouchers growing, those are the kids that have kind of been there all the time, that are their siblings are coming into these programs. What's going on for about a quarter of voucher users is they've left the public school system, perhaps because they've been convinced to do so. And they suffer on average devastating academic harm. And to me, the moral case for vouchers comes down to this fact that it's a false promise, and that it's intentionally directed. The arguments for opportunity are intentionally directed toward kids who, maybe their families have struggled in an educational setting before. And if it's not an educational setting, they've struggled economically, or they struggled with racial discrimination, or whatever it is. And voucher programs just kind of come in and say, "Hey, listen, come to us. We're a private school." I think that idea of this elite private school is completely false when it comes to the voucher programs participating private schools, and it's preying on vulnerable kids to make money, and it's absolutely wrong.
One question, Josh, that I get asked all the time was, so I'm going to ask you the same question I get asked, which is that, there is a long history of asking people, voters, public, even dating back to the 70s, when polls are done about vouchers versus public schools, whatever they're gussied up or talked about or how they're talked about, decidedly, most of the public, most of the voting public, most parents are for public schools. And in fact, a recent Heart poll that we sponsored right about a month after the election, there was an 80-20 split about voters and policymakers when they were asked this question. So we asked it specifically this way, knowing full well what you just said earlier in the podcast, that the voucher proponents are literally using the fear and the trauma and all of these other things from the post-COVID world. They're using all that. So we asked this straight up, if you had only one choice between focusing on improving public education in public schools or expanding school choice, and we use those words, one choice, strengthening public schools or expanding school choice, by an 80-20 split a month after the election, voters, including parents, said, let's improve public schools.
Yes.
So that just happened a month after the election. And then a month after that, you see these huge burgeoning of the voucher programs in state legislatures. So if the majority of Americans are not interested, they do not want this, they want us to strengthen public schools, why do you think that these ideologues are pushing them so hard?
I think it's about undermining faith and confidence and participation in civic institutions in general. I said earlier that some of the biggest funders, there's a group called the Bradley Foundation, for example, based in Wisconsin, a group, the Heritage Foundation, which most of your listeners probably are aware of, are based in DC, but they're the biggest kind of I guess think tanky type organization propping vouchers up. They also, their political wing is also extraordinarily active in election denial stuff. So vote suppression, things like this. None of this is all based on very high, reporting from the New Yorker and people like that. And these are all linked. These aren't accidental. So I think they're groups that sort of have decided to take this kind of anti-civic approach, and that includes public schools. Public schools. Henry Louis Gates, the famous sort of Harvard professor, wrote an op-ed just yesterday actually, on the DeSantis push against Black history and how that has striking, frightening similarities to lost cause mythology from the Confederacy in the late 19th century, early 20th century, and it was based on this rewriting of history. And, Gates makes the point that I think we all, as educators, one way or the other, all understand, which is that, education is sort of always, for better or worse, on the front lines of democratic development, right? And so we're talking about literally the next generation that we work with, that you work with, that I work with. And so I think that this is why the kind of culture war element and all of the discriminatory stuff we've talked about. Listen, I mean, again, Brown versus Board of Education, the Supreme Court ruling against segregation in this country focused on public schools first. And that's why I think that they're attacking these organizations. But I think one of the things that your point's really important, and that is the underlying support that most people have for public education. I mean, I think that's most parents, even if those who conceptually think that more choices should be available, they are supportive of public schools, and they are especially opposed to defunding public schools. The tell there, the tell that the voucher supporters agree with us on that reading of public opinion, is how much they're right now rhetorically bending over backwards to try to hide the fact that these programs do defund public schools. If they thought that for all the attacks that they have made on public education, right, they still have not argued, at least not the sort of the political leaders, have still not argued that we should defund public education for how apparently horrible all of them want us to believe that it is. And that's because they see the same polls you and I do, right? And so they know that defunding public schools is extremely unpopular. And so right. with the left hand, they want to hit public schools over the head and say, wokeism and indoctrination and all these terrible things. And with the right hand, they want to keep giving public schools money or pretending that they're going to give public schools money because they know how unpopular it is. To the point where in some of these very red states, all of these programs are getting rammed through in red states, by the way, but to the point where they're even dangling little modest increases, 1-time, 2-time increases in public money, or little kind of sweeteners to try to pull more votes in, and none of those are long-term plans. I mean, right. But that's voucher.
And most of them are using the Biden American Rescue Plan.
Yeah.
So the money they've gotten from Biden and from the feds, they're using that for these one-shots.
And I want to just say, just because I'm a researcher and not a political strategist, so I can't talk about necessarily how they're arranging these votes in these legislatures, but I do want to point out that while we're on the topic of public investment, while over the last decade we've seen these catastrophic academic outcomes for vouchers, we've also seen a solidifying of study after study after study. I think we're at 16 straight studies now in the research community in this area of how important deep, sustained, and direct investments in public schools and what kind of payoff those actually make. For a long time, as you are well aware, conservatives sort of organized around this idea that we can't spend more money on public schools because it's just throwing money away, and none of that has actually ever been true. But now we've got some of the top intellectual sort of education policy folks in the country who've studied this. It's essentially settled, to quote a guy named Carabo Jackson at Northwestern. We know that investing in public schools really has it's not just payoffs on test scores, although that happens too. It's not just payoffs on graduation rates, although that happens too. It's generational transfers of wealth and opportunity when you invest in public schools. So while we've been seeing all this catastrophic evidence for vouchers, we've also been seeing this slow, steady buildup of really incontrovertible evidence that investments in public education matter. I think people get this. I don't think most people, it's not that hard. And I think one of the reasons that we're having this conversation today is that we've seen extremely wealthy organized interests kind of pushing these programs in very small legislators where money goes a long way. Texas being the one non-small example, but money goes a long way. There's not a lot of progressives don't have a strong foothold right now, although there are many committed progressives and public school advocates in these communities, and they're just it's nearly just buying votes essentially. I just testified in Nebraska the other day, and we know that. Just as an example, Betsy DeVos herself, not just her husband who gave some and family members, Betsy DeVos herself gave $1.2 million to legislative races in Nebraska over the fall. $1.2 million for, remember, Nebraska was unicameral, so they just have a few legislators there to ram this thing through. $1.2 million goes a long, long way in middle American legislative races for a part-time legislature. So that's a lot of what's going on. This is not reflecting popular opinion any more than Moms for Liberty. It reflects the way a typical mom thinks. This is just ramming stuff through.
Yeah. So let me ask you one last question, which is, so what advice do you have for families or students who are being told that, vouchers are an option, and what should they be looking for?
It's a really good question, and not one that I've been asked directly since I've been talking about all this publicly in the last year. What families need to, I think my advice would be, look at the fine print and don't assume that because you want to go to a school or you want your child, unless it's a public school, or you want your child to go to a school, that school is going to want you. I've said before, when it comes to these programs, it's not parents' choice, it's the school's choice. The school gets to pick, and your child doesn't have to be an LGBTQ child. You don't have to be an LGBTQ parent. You don't have to be a parent of color for the school to discriminate against you. The school may not want you. Your kid may not score on a certain exam. Read the fine print and know what the school is saying it's going to do. And even if you are thinking about these types of programs, just understand that none of this is really about the educational opportunity for your child, and most of this is about standing up a separate system that's going to compete with public education. And listen, if the public school that you're in, most Americans are actually quite satisfied with their public school. It's another one of those. Not only are they satisfied with public schools in general, but they're particularly happy with the school their kids are in. But listen, it's like family members. Like we all have areas we wish we could grow a little more with our families and our and if you want some improvement to be made in your community school, then there's plenty of opportunities to do it. Run for school board, talk to your principal, talk to your teachers. We know that teachers love to talk to you about your kids' progress. Like, working within the system is a much more reliable way to invest long-term. And I don't want to get off on a topic I don't know totally about, but we're in this other debate right now that about privatizing Social Security. And there's a lot of similarities between the privatized Social Security and the privatized education crowd. And both of them rely on this general idea that, the support that we've put into the social safety net through Social Security is somehow not good enough. And go ask a senior, how they feel about Social Security, if that's not good enough for them. And think about that when we think about public schools, right? Like what voucher proponents are selling you is, you take your money out, or your kid's education, in this case, out of the public investment, and you move it to a high-risk strategy that overwhelmingly has failed to pay off over the last decade for kids. And you just sort of think about, do I want to put my kid in this really risky environment, or do I want to kind of stick with the community school that I know? If I want to make some changes there, there's opportunities to do that, because public schools are transparent, they're community oriented, and they're governed by elected bodies, which is not something that we can say for these shady private providers.
Yeah. I mean, look, transparency and accountability are key in terms of democracy, whether, that's what voice is. Voice is about, whether you like it or not, people have a right to know and people have a right to have a voice. And, the privatization of this just takes that out of the equation.
It does.
And so I want to, we've taken much too much of your time today. But I want to just make sure, was there a big area that I didn't cover? Is there something that you get off the podcast and say, shoot, I wish Randi asked me this?
No, I think I think this is all really great. And I guess I would just stress, and you can use it however you want, that we have to, I think, understand that when it comes to these programs, the fix is in. And it's really not an exaggeration to say, I mean, I have said this, like, to get as close to we can on what the academic harm that these programs have done to kids, you have to go to what COVID-19 did to test scores more recently, what Katrina did in New Orleans. Like, these are catastrophic. These are not just little arguments about, maybe test scores aren't what we want, but they've got other good things going. The fix is in when it comes to these programs, and really, you can't stress that enough.
Yeah. So, Josh, if people want more information about your research, they know that they can reach us at aft.org, on Facebook. My Twitter is R.Weingarten. But if people want more information on your research, what should they follow? Who should they follow? I just retweeted one of your tweets from this morning. You were on campus.
Appreciate that. For folks who are on social media, I have an account. It's Josh Cowen, JoshCowen MSU but more generally, I'm around. I'm writing a lot of pieces in newspapers right now, and we'll find a way to distribute that information. Also, unlike a voucher school, I'm a public employee, and my email is a public email, and you can email me at jcowen.msu.edu, and that's it's all transparent.
Thank you so much, Josh. And as I said, as we had your dogs, we are in the middle of New York right now on President's Day, and there's a bunch of ambulances that are going, by my window, and it's like 60 degrees out today. So this is real. We're trying to make these podcasts real, and we tape them wherever we can. And so I just want to say thank you, Josh, so much for making time today. And as you know, the AFT family sends love to you and everyone impacted by the tragedy at Michigan State. And we are fighting 24/7 for better gun safety and common sense gun laws. We have to stop the weapon that has created this killing and this shattering of lives. And frankly, if Australia can do it, we should be able to do it. Massachusetts has done a whole bunch, even with what's going on with the Supreme Court. Massachusetts has done a whole bunch of things to create, more safety from gun violence in its state. And I know that there have been legislators who have put those bills forward in Lansing this week. And and the kids are fighting for it, and the staff is fighting for it. And let's see what we can do in terms of better common sense gun laws in Michigan. I also just want to say to all of us who are listening, Josh has been literally that voice, that clarion call with his research about vouchers for a very long time, and I rely on him, as do so many others. And he's professor in a public university. And so I just want to make sure and I want to say this to our listeners as well, this is about what we are trying to do. Josh's work is about helping to commit this country and our institutions and our democracy to all of our children's futures. and to ensuring that we have this kind of this proper investment to ensure that kids have a future and that we have a thriving, welcoming, safe, diverse democracy. That's what the promise of public education is, and that's what we are all after. And so to our listeners, thank you for listening. And to Josh, thank you for being my guest today.
Thank you.
And this is Union Talk.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of Union Talk. Remember to subscribe wherever you listen to your podcast and tune in every other week for a new episode. Thank you, be safe, and be well.